Mr. President, I had an opportunity early last week to give a speech at the Brookings Institution about the United States' significant opportunity when it comes to energy production and our opportunity as a nation to expand our energy trade. And I was able to present this speech based on a white paper that I have recently released. It's entitled A Signal to the World, Renovating the Architecture of U.S. Energy Exports. This builds on a document that I presented to this body, to my colleagues, to really folks who cared about any aspect of what's going on within the energy industry within our country and our energy opportunities. It's a document that I entitled Energy 2020. It was 115 pages of not legislation, but really concepts, discussion points, areas where I feel that we as a nation have an opportunity to lead when it comes to our energy potential. And when we talk about energy in our country, it's really easy to talk about kind of all of the above. But I really did make a very concerted effort to address all forms of energy that we in this country are blessed to have, whether it's our traditional fossil fuels, our oil, our natural gas, our coal resources, whether it's the enormous potential that we have with our renewable fuel sources, such as wind and solar and geothermal and ocean energy, marine hydrokinetic, our hydropower, the opportunities that present themselves with our biofuels, the importance, the great significance of nuclear within our energy portfolio. And so I didn't want that document to just be yet another document that somebody produces, some good ideas that are thrown out there to just founder. So I have been working to present a series of these white papers. Had an opportunity to present one several months back on natural gas. Now, this week, it is a paper on the architecture, again, of U.S. energy exports. In several weeks, I plan on introducing yet another. So I've come to the floor this afternoon to share my thoughts on energy exports with the Senate, all energy exports, and to enter my recommendations on this important subject into the congressional record. My point, again, is not to trot out legislation in one area or another, but as a nation, to have us focus on our energy potential, and again, all of our energy potential, and our opportunity to utilize this energy potential to share this amazing wealth that we have, whether it is within our traditional fuels or whether it is within our renewables or our non-traditional, but to really focus on what it means as a nation to be a nation that enjoys energy abundance rather than a nation that faces energy scarcity. And I think it's fair to say that for far too long, the conversation has been based from a position of energy scarcity. It's time to change that focus. It's time to shift that dialogue, that debate, to how do we perform, how do we operate, how do we take advantage of our relative abundance. Now, before I start my comments and kind of summarize my white paper and the speech that I gave, I'd like to pause for a quick note. This is the cover of my white paper, which will form the basis for my remarks today. I chose a U.S. Navy photograph that was taken aboard the USS Carl Vinson. It was taken by Mass Communications Specialist, Second Class James R. Evans, I want to make sure that he gets proper credit for the photograph, because as I look at it, it gives me the sense of optimism that I think that we should all have about the future of our energy trade. I think that future is bright. I think it's promising. So let's start the discussion by looking exactly at the opportunity that we do have before us. Simply put, the United States is both producing and exporting more energy now than ever before. We are producing and we are exporting more than we ever have before. Net energy imports are at a 20-year low and projected to fall below 5% of total consumption by the year 2025. Now, to put this into perspective, when I came here to the United States Senate, we were importing about 60% of our oil at that time. Net energy imports now at a 20-year low, projected to fall below 5% of total consumption by 2025. So this is all energy imports. Energy exports are reducing our trade deficit. They're boosting American commerce around the world. We've been talking all this week and last about unemployment insurance, how we can work to really improve the economy for those that lack jobs or are underemployed. Let me tell you, Mr. President, this is an area of opportunity when it comes to our energy production. So energy exports are helping us with our trade deficit, and they're boosting commerce and jobs. But the regulatory architecture, the framework that we're operating in that governs energy exports, is really antiquated. It goes back to acts that were passed in the 30s, in the 50s, in the 70s, and furthermore, they're applied unevenly across the sector. So my white paper proposes a series of recommendations to renovate our nation's approach to energy trade and strengthen America's global posture. And I know, Mr. President, that around here, when you put an idea out on the floor, you also put a target on your back. But I think this is an important discussion for us to have. So again, we're not proffering legislation, but what I am pushing, what I am going to edge my colleagues towards, is a greater discussion about energy and energy exports. Now, the first resource that I wrote about in my white paper was coal. I think we have to acknowledge these are some pretty uncertain times for truly what has been the backbone of the U.S. energy supply. Coal is projected to remain the top source of electricity for the next 2 decades, but we know that it faces competition from other energy sources. There's clearly a regulatory effort that will make the construction of new plants an extremely difficult endeavor. But I think you can see here that net exports of coal, though they're at their highest level on record and as a share of their production, they're really at their highest level in 30 years here now. Exports of coal are presently free of burdensome regulations. I think that they should remain so. I think that our federal regulatory agencies should not require climate change studies in the course of their permitting process for any proposed facilities. And I say this because coal is going to be consumed around the world regardless of U.S. trade policy. We know that, we see that, we can point to the countries where they're seeing increased coal imports. The only question here, the real question that we're talking about, is whether or not the coal is produced here in North America. And if it's produced here in North America, the environmental standards are going to be higher than they will elsewhere. So the real question is, do you produce it where you have stronger environmental standards, or are you going to get it from countries where their environmental standards are held to a lower level? The next resource that we're talking about is natural gas. Great deal of discussion of late about natural gas. North America is quickly emerging as one of the world's most important hubs for the natural gas trade. Record levels are flowing to Mexico and Canada via pipeline. The build-out of seaborne export capacity, which requires the liquefaction of gas for unloading onto cargo ships, I think is proceeding too slow under the Department of Energy's watch. Other nations are approving capacity, they're securing financing, they're building projects, and they're contracting with customers. They're making these long-term contracts ahead of the United States. So a little more in depth on this particular resource area, building on the white paper here. I think that DOE should expedite its review process for applications to export LNG to non-FTA countries. The last time that an application was approved was back in mid-November. It's over 2 months ago now. I don't see the reason for continued delay here. I do think that we have to monitor the role of the other agencies that are involved in this. We have the FERC, we have the Maritime Administration, we have the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. I think it's important to understand whether or not this process is as streamlined and as functional as it should be. Now, there are some who are suggesting that there needs to be a pause button pushed here, whether it's at DOE, at the FERC, or any other agency. No new study should be commissioned, as the nearest study from 2012, I think, is more than adequate. I think DOE has access to all the latest EIA and the other market data when it issues its orders. Our allies overseas and American workers here at home, I think, have waited long enough. We can do more, and we can do it in an expedited manner. The third area are natural gas liquids. A variety of fuels are produced alongside oil and gas as part of the energy renaissance underway here in this country. You have butane, propane, you've got pentanes plus. These are known as natural gas liquids. And they've got various uses. They've not typically represented a major source of either revenue or volume to American exporters. And since the energy renaissance has begun, we have seen exports of more of these products on the uptake. We've seen them surge. The regulatory structure that surrounds NGL export, I think, are working pretty well. They're working smoothly. I don't think that they require modification. Trade in these products plays a valuable role in reducing volatility and creating additional demand to stimulate production. Now, next is the issue of crude oil and condensates. Obviously, generates a little more interest and discussion, and that's okay, because again, I want to have this discussion. We are producing more oil in this country today than at any point in the past 20 years. And what has happened is this increase has resulted in a plethora of what's known as light, tight oil. And this is coming from the Bakken, from the Eagle Ford, and for other plays around the country. And this crude is lighter and sweeter than the U.S. refinery system was really built to accommodate. So existing capacity, upgrades to existing refineries, and logistical feats to transport that light crude to appropriate refiners on the East Coast instead of over on the Gulf Coast where you have the heavy refining capacity where that dominates. These have allowed for new volumes of light crude to be refined and brought to global markets as product. So you have a situation where under existing regulations, the Department of Commerce may license the export of crude oil under certain conditions, most notably if that oil is destined for Canada. But in addition, you have large amounts of condensate, other hydrocarbon that cannot be exported. And these are also being produced along with record levels of crude and natural gas. Now, many producers fear that rising light crude production will soon exceed not only our light refining capacity, but also the ability of our refiners to adapt to the new production slate. And so when this point is reached, when this mismatch occurs, the U.S. oil resurgent, I think, collides with the de facto ban that we have on crude oil exports. Now, you're going to hear people say, you're going to hear the opponents argue that lifting the ban is somehow or other going to increase the price of gasoline. Well, coming from a state where we have probably some of the highest gas prices at the pump anywhere. That's not my interest. That's clearly not my interest. But I think that there's a number of sound economic reasons why this is not going to be the case. First, gasoline is a petroleum product, and petroleum products are subject to global pricing, just like crude oil. So to the extent that greater U.S. production of crude oil puts downward pressure on the international oil prices, then production increases have benefited U.S. consumers by marginally lowering the gasoline and the crude oil prices. American consumers are already generally paying a global price for petroleum products, including gasoline, and would also benefit to the extent that lifting the ban on crude oil exports would send a positive signal to oil producers to then increase production. Second point here is the cost of inaction. Prohibitions on the free trade of any product, with all things being equal, increases the prices, it creates market distortions, it leads to misallocation of capital, and it has a deleterious impact on job creation. So to the extent that the crude oil export ban contributes to supply disruptions and decelerating oil production, which affects unemployment, then the American consumer suffers these consequences. So I have taken the position that the status quo does not benefit the American consumer. In fact, not acting could actually negatively impact the nation. All sectors of the U.S. oil industry are global leaders. Upstream, you have American technology and expertise that enables the growth in production. Midstream, you have a complex network of pipelines that transports that oil across the country safely every day. And then, of course, downstream, you have American refiners who are among the most advanced in the world. So lifting the de facto ban will strengthen this system by protecting jobs, boosting production, and enhancing efficiency and specialization. Now, I mentioned the Commerce Department earlier. They may retain sufficient statutory authority to lift the ban on its own as part of a larger swap. Now, some have suggested trading U.S. light crude for Mexican heavy, which sounds interesting, but it's a little more complicated than that. The President may also make a national interest determination that the present regulatory structure, which generally prohibits crude oil exports, is unnecessary and counterproductive. White House action on this matter is of course, the shortest way from point A to point B, and if the President is so inclined, he can call me. He can count on my full support on this. If the White House disagrees with this interpretation of its authority, or it chooses to maintain the prohibition on exports, then I think it would be appropriate for this body, for the Senate, to update the laws to reflect 21st century conditions. Now, after crude oil and condensates is the growing success story of our petroleum products and their exports. An enormous expansion of the American export profile in global petroleum product markets has accompanied the crude oil resurgence. Exports of petroleum products must continue without burdensome regulations. The U.S. refining industry is the global leader and delivers gasoline, diesel, and other fuel to American friends and allies around the world. These fuels will be consumed whether or not they're imported from the U.S., which, again, uses the strictest environmental standards. And then, of course, when we're talking about energy production and our opportunities for exports, there is our renewable energy resource. There's renewable technology. Producers of wind turbines, solar panels, and other renewable technologies also help reduce the U.S. trade deficit through our exports. So again, very important to make sure that when we're talking about energy exports, let's truly talk about all of them, including our renewable technologies. I think that the general lack of trade restrictions on renewable energy technology products doesn't need to be modified. If renewable technology is the future, then it needs to be competitive. And then finally, the last area is nuclear technology. The United States has been the undisputed leader of nuclear technology throughout the world. We produce more nuclear power than any other nation. And as the global nuclear trade has developed, what we've seen is that the U.S. market share there has declined. I think that the federal government must continue its efforts to help develop small modular reactors. And I think that we can do this without putting international security at risk or violating non-proliferation controls. Mr. President, the energy resurgence has fueled a beneficial expansion of U.S. energy trade. And the evidence is clear that exports can help facilitate enhanced production by opening up U.S. supply to global markets. Trade is creating jobs, it's increasing supply, it's enhancing our nation's security, without doubt. Competition and efficiency are the strengths of the American economy system. They're not defects. Trade and consumption will occur with or without us. So the question here is whether or not we can enhance or whether we will demote our global position. And to the extent that American-made energy can displace other less clean sources, then the global environment will benefit from enhanced U.S. trade. People come first, though. We recognize that. The nation's opportunity to help us alleviate energy policy is one that we should not miss. I believe, Mr. President, that we need to send a powerful signal to the world that the U.S. is ready to reassert its role as a leader on energy, the environment, and trade. And to me, that is a signal worth sending. And so, as I've said, this is a debate worth having here in the Senate, here in this new year. And I look forward to joining my colleagues. I know that there are many who, on the other side, who have differing views when it comes to our fossil fuels. But I think that we would find alignment in other areas when we were talking about our energy exports and our great potential. So as we are trying to build our nation's economy, as we are trying to strengthen jobs across the country, let us not forget the enormous potential, the enormous growth potential that we hold when it comes to our energy production and potential for energy export. With that, Mr. President, I thank you for your attention, and I yield the